everything you heard from Donald Trump last night, everything you heard from Pete Hegseth so far is spin. It's an absolute spin. Now, it's spin with political importance, which I can explain to you as we start to talk about why the Trump administration did this and will they attack again.
Scott Lucas, Professor of American and International Studies at the Clinton Institute, of course, at the University of Dublin. Thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Maddie. Is there anything happening we should be discussing today?
You and I are having an emergency Trump Report session today. We usually don't work on the weekends, but of course we had to have this emergency meeting of the minds because so much has happened. Donald Trump addressed the media. He addressed everyone pretty much last night. On Saturday, he officially announced that the United States had orchestrated a bombing attack on Iran. I'm going to read out the quote. He said, "Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and to stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's number one state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. So 3 nuclear power plants have been, not power plants, weapons, I guess, have been destroyed, Scott. So can you walk me through your reaction to this?"
Okay, so the setup is that, as you mentioned, Saturday night U.S. time, early Sunday morning Iran time, 7 B-2 bombers carrying, in some cases, what they call the mother of all bombs. These are the bunker busters that each one of which is more than 13,000 kilograms. They hit 3 sites in Iran. Now, 2 of the 3 sites had already been hit by the Israelis. That's Natanz and Isfahan. The 3rd site, and why the Israelis wanted the Americans in from a military perspective, is Fordow. Now, Fordow, because of the fear of Israeli strikes, Iran built this one into the side of a mountain. So it's effectively heavily fortified by that position. And so the Americans in particular were going to use the bunker busters on this site. Fordow and Natanz are where they enrich the uranium. And they enrich up to 60%, but not, and I must emphasize this, not military grade of more than 90%. So it's not nuclear weapons grade yet. Isfahan is used for production of the centrifuges that are used for the uranium enrichment. Now, the starting key point, if you're from talking about the military perspective, and this was not answered by the latest press conference by the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because they said we're still doing the battle damage assessment. In other words, how much damage did they cause? Now, that is key. It's ironic, I'll mention this, the only damage assessment that we had so far is actually from the International Atomic Energy Agency, a far different organization. But because they're responsible for overseeing Iran's nuclear plans, they looked at Isfahan and they said that there's damage to 10 buildings, 4 of which had been hit by the Israelis, 6 new buildings by the Americans, and that is likely to have caused some damage to the manufacture of centrifuges, right?
Sorry, Scott, so how accurate is it for the Trump administration to come out and say that they've completely obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities?
It isn't accurate because they don't know yet, which is the key point I want to get to. And that is the Israelis had limited the Natanz facility. They had destroyed centrifuges or cut the power supply to centrifuges there. But Fordow, the Americans go in, and what we have so far in terms of evidence is there's some satellite photographs that show Fordow above ground, right? So you can see that bombs hit the site. But of course, they can't tell you what damage was done underground. So we do not know at this point, and it'll be interesting to see how the American military reach their assessment. But everything you heard from Donald Trump last night, everything you heard from Pete Hegseth so far is spin. It's an absolute spin. Now, it's spin with political importance, which I can explain to you as we start to talk about why the Trump administration did this and will they attack again. The starting point politically, which you and I talked about the last time we spoke, was that Israel manipulated Donald Trump into this position. And just the very quick recap, in February, Trump, with Benjamin Netanyahu beside him, looking very, very unsettled, Trump says, we're going to have negotiations with the Iranians. Now, Netanyahu didn't want that. He wanted Trump to approve Israel's plans to attack. Up until a couple weeks ago, we're talking U.S.-Iran negotiations, and then when Israel attacks, it scuppers the American negotiations with Iran. The six that don't take place. Supposed to be a week ago today. Now, what Israel has done is they've played Trump by saying, you can have your deal, but the Iranians need to be punished first. They need to be weakened, and then they'll come to the table and they'll effectively surrender to you. Now, at that point, when the Israelis start the attacks, the question is, will the Americans join, right? And when you and I talked last week, Trump was going wobbly, right? Trump went wobbly because he said, oh, I'll decide within the next 2 weeks. Now, he did that for two reasons, both of which come into play as we speak now on the Sunday. The first is, will the bunker busters work? Because if the bunker busters don't cause significant damage to the Fordow plant, the Iranians are going to celebrate a victory, right? We withstood the biggest bomb the Americans have. So Trump wasn't quite sure he wanted to go ahead with this. Secondly, there's this domestic issue of a split in that some Trumpists favor the attacks on Iran, some do not. Now, I'm going to bring the military and the political together with this immediate point. If the Americans have caused significant damage to the Fordow plant in Iran, if they have limited Iran's ability to enrich uranium, they can declare job done. It's a one-time strike. They can step back and they don't risk that split amongst the Trumpists. But if they haven't caused significant damage to Fordow, they either have to accept the defeat or they have to go again. And if they go again for a second round of strikes, what's the effect on the domestic opinion? And I'll leave the ant hanging because I'll have the follow-up on just a second on that.
No, Scott, this is a really interesting point because, yes, what happens next will define his legacy, but will define the way in which we see a division in the Republican Party, in the MAGA base. But I want to just get onto this 2-week deadline because, yes, last week you and I spoke. Donald Trump issued a 2-week deadline to Iran, and it was a way in which to get them back to the negotiating table. It was a way in which to not ruffle any more feathers because we could do this in a more diplomatic way. We get Iran back to the negotiating table to discuss a nuclear deal, and there wouldn't have to be any more conflict, and we wouldn't have to send US military into Iran's airspace, and we wouldn't have to really risk any attacks from the US side. Do you think, and then of course only a few days later we see the US strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Do you think this 2-week deadline was legit from Donald Trump, or do you think it was a distraction?
Could be either. I mean, it is possible that just as the Iranians were lulled into a false sense of security by their ongoing negotiations with the U.S., and then the Israelis attacked anyway, that Trump or his advisors could have said, look, we'll lull them into a false sense of security just before we go in with the attack. Alternatively, it could be a very unpredictable and very chaotic Trump. And I'm just going to put out one fact. I'm surprised people haven't picked up on this. Remember, Trump was on the verge of this attack on Iranian facilities during his first term. I think it was 2019. And they had the bombers in the air, or they were about to get in the air, and they were close to the point of no return, and then Trump blanked and pulled them back. Now, in this case, what happens is that having said that the attack was imminent, Trump on Thursday made this 2-week announcement. I'm going to add this, which I think other people haven't picked up on as well. On Friday, the Europeans sat down with the Iranians, right? And they sat down and they were going to talk about how can we get back to the negotiating table. Now, the Iranians said that the European proposals were unreasonable in what they were asking of Iran regarding the uranium program, but they said, we are going to keep talking. We're going to have more negotiations. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that either the Israelis or someone in the Trump administration went back to Trump and said, look, the Iranians just said that the Europeans are being unreasonable there goes your window for diplomacy. You've got to make the attack, right? In other words, what we don't know, and it's vital, is we know there's a split in the Trump administration about whether or not to go ahead with this attack. We don't know who Trump talked to between that announcement of the 2-week window and then the decision to make the order. Because you know the statement, which is all too true, he listens to the last person in the room. And we don't know who those people were. What we know is that now the Trump administration, even those who oppose this, now have a collective decision that they have to stand by. And if they've done their damage, they, I think, get off with now letting the Israelis continue the attacks, et cetera, et cetera. If they haven't, they've got to discuss what their next step is. And other people, especially I'm looking at the Gulf states and the Europeans, they've got to discuss where they go next.
So, Scott, I mean, this right now would be a good time for there to be a signal group chat leak so we could figure out what the game plan here was. But my takeaway is that maybe Pete Hegseth was one of the final calls to bomb Iran. But of course, yeah, we did see a lot of big Trumpists come out last week and say that they did not support the idea of getting involved. But we also don't know if Donald Trump has marketed this to his inner circle and the Republican Party as a one-hit job.
Yeah.
We're just going to go in. Yeah, we're just going to go in. We're going to try it out and then we're going to leave. But the problem now being is if the US military actually didn't obliterate all of their nuclear capabilities, I don't know if Trump would come out and say that. If in the next week or so they found out that, look, there was still some nuclear capabilities, potentially even atomic bomb, because we don't know in the last few weeks where Iran has gone and moved their nuclear weapons, because we know that they were looking at moving them from areas that perhaps US intelligence knew where they were.
No.
And then the other thing is, even if the US did actually get rid of their nuclear capabilities, would Iran admit to that?
Okay, let me stress first of all that it's not nuclear weapons being moved from these places. Okay, Iran does not have nuclear weapons. They're not producing nuclear weapons. What you're talking about is, did they move the equipment for enriching uranium?
Yes.
Did they move that, especially from Fort? Now the Iranians say they did.
But Scott, sorry to interrupt. Isn't there reason to believe that they've already built an atomic bomb or are near to it?
No, I need to walk through this very carefully, Maddie, which is with the breakdown of the 2000, when Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement with Iran in 2018, which had been made with the other 5+1 powers, plus the US, Germany, France, UK, China, Russia. That agreement limited Iran to manufacture of 3.6 and 7% uranium, and they shipped all their 20% uranium outside the country. Now, when Trump walked out of that agreement and imposed comprehensive sanctions, Iran effectively set the agreement aside to produce 20% uranium initially. And then in April 2021, they started producing 60% uranium. But here's the kicker. 60% uranium is not fortified enough for a nuclear warhead. And Iran has never made that final step to go beyond 90%. Now, some experts think they have the capability to do that, but they've never made the final step. And that's the very small but important line. They have what in effect is breakout capability. If they decided to manufacture a nuclear weapon, they could do so fairly quickly. But they've never crossed the line. And the International Atomic Energy Agency said last week, just days before the US attack, Iran is not currently pursuing that capability. In March, the US intelligence community and the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said the Iranians are not pursuing nuclear weapons capability. So I suspect what went down, before I talk about the Europeans in the Gulf, which I suspect it would have, and this is a little bit of speculation, but I think Pistol Pete Hegseth, he's a cipher. He's there to go out and appear before the cameras like he did just a bit, like he used to do on Fox TV, pretending to be a military expert. Okay? What's more important are the military guys in the Pentagon who said, is it possible to do this? And they told the Trump administration, we think we can hit these facilities, right? That's where the defense is. Marco plays all sides. So I think Marco's playing very cagey here and so on. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has opposed a strike on Iran. has done so for even before she was in the Trump administration. I think the director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, would have favored a strike. He would be more hawkish. And I think the key player here is J.D. Vance. Because J.D., who has his own personal ambitions, J.D., who calculates in terms of, he's very pragmatic, and he's also very manipulative. J.D. is the guy who's been talking to the Republicans in Congress, trying to get them to buy this attack. He was there talking to them earlier this week about that. And I think Vance probably came down on the side of this and said, yeah, we can manage the Republican Party over this. And I think that...
You think JD Vance is behind Trump's attack, was the one in Trump's ear?
I think JD was key in saying that this will not split the Trumpists, especially the Trumpists in Capitol Hill, right? That the Congress will not come out against you. Because the Democrats, of course, as you expect them to say, there's no declaration of war. We're insisting on a declaration of war. Now, they're not going to get that. But you need the Republicans to hold firm up on the Hill. So I'd keep an eye on that. I also think, of course, there's a lot of lobby groups who would have been trying to get to various administration officials, especially pro-Israel lobby groups that would have gone in. This all would have played. And I do think that it was when Trump got an assurance that this would work, and then when he had the assurance that, okay, we're not going to get the pushback from the Republicans, that then the Israelis have got the space. Because the Israelis are the loudest voice in his ear. I mean, let's just say that right now. Okay, where next? Where you're asking me. What's interesting today, let's start with the U.S. and then work wider, is that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio have both been speaking to press, as well as Hegseth. Now, Hegseth is just a cheerleader, right? And I listened to that presser, and there was absolutely nothing of value out of it from a substantive viewpoint. What J.D. Vance and Rubio are saying is quite interesting. They are both going out and saying, we carried out this attack not for regime change, right? Which is what the Israelis really want, although they won't call it that. We carried out this attack to hit the nuclear capabilities. And the implication of what JD and Rubio are saying is that because there won't be regime change, Iran can come back to the negotiating table, but they have no chance of getting enrichment capability. None, yep. Right? Secondly, in support of that, Rubio is saying there are no plans for a further U.S. strike, right? So what it looks like is Vance and Rubio, in effect, are saying this is a demonstration attack, irrespective of how much damage it causes. This is a demonstration attack. We're now telling you in Tehran, we can do this. You come and you accept our demands, which is you get rid of your nuclear program, not your nuclear weapons program, your entire civil nuclear program. You get rid of it entirely. I think that's the play here from Washington. If that is the play, there's a space for the Europeans and the Gulf states. Because the other thing I've watched today has been their reaction closely. The Europeans, of course, had negotiated with the Iranians on Friday. And they were calling for pretty strict conditions on the Iranians. You've got to really limit your enrichment program. The Europeans can now go back to the Iranians and they can press that, right? But there's a bit of a disconnect. Most European leaders simply said, de-escalate, get back to negotiations. Keir Starmer, for reasons I don't fully understand, endorsed the U.S. attacks. He said the U.S., in the social media post, the U.S. needed to do this. I think Starmer has fouled the nest here because the Iranians are not going to like that message coming from the UK that supports the Trump attack. It's much different if you get Francis Macron, if you get Germany's Merz who are saying, not openly, we don't support the U.S. attack, but putting the emphasis on de-escalation. And the other powers of the Gulf states, because they've come out and they've condemned this attack. Some of them more loudly than others. Qatar has said it breaks international law. So they've been firm. This condemns it. Interestingly, the UAE has also criticized it, but the Saudis have said, and this is their language very carefully, we reiterate what we have said before about Iranian sovereignty. Now, they said that about the Israeli attacks. They're saying to the United States, don't go in for regime change. Don't go in to break this country up. And I suspect if those lines from Rubio and Vance intersect with what Saudi is saying, which I think they do, I think your question now is, will Tehran accept what is close to a U.S. ultimatum to return to the negotiations?
It is really interesting to see how the Gulf states, and yes, of course, Europe and France have, uh, UK and France and other EU countries have responded, because especially when Donald Trump has gone to these Gulf states in the last month or so and brokered these economic deals with them, Scott, and really tried to bring back relationships with them, and of course put Israel in a pretty awkward position
Yeah.
when accepting this 747, when making economic deals with Qatar, which is of course funding and housing Hamas.
Yeah.
So there's so many moving parts to this conflict. But what we saw was Pete Hegseth come out and say that if there's retaliation on Iran's part, then the situation will escalate further. As you said, there's no plans right now for any further strikes, but they threatened that if Iran retaliates, whether that be on US military bases or not, there will be further attacks. And of course, Iran came out and said that the United States had crossed a very red line. My question to you
Yeah.
is, do you think there will be retaliations as opposed to coming back to the negotiating table, as you said? And if so, do you think Americans should be worried?
I I can't, no prediction should be 100% sure at this point.
Yeah.
But I would be surprised if the Iranians responded with an attack outside of Israel, an open attack outside of Israel, especially on American personnel. Now, the Iranians did respond this morning, it should be noted, with at least 30 missiles on Israel. And while there were very few serious casualties, I think there were only 2 people moderately wounded, they did destroy some residential buildings. It's just because the Israelis were in shelters that the casualty toll was low. I think they'll keep doing that. Their missile stocks are dwindling, but they'll keep lobbing those at them. But if you talk about what Iran could do outside of Israel, look, if Iran, there are 40,000 American personnel within reach of Iranian drones and missiles, right? There's also Iranian-led militias who in the past have attacked American personnel on bases in Iraq, in Syria, and in Jordan, killing a few of them. But when the Iranian-led militias did this during the Biden administration and killed at least 3 troops and a contractor, if I remember correctly, the Biden administration launched holy hell on them with airstrikes. And we know the Trump administration will go farther. So I'd be surprised if the militias were cut loose.
When you look at the situation right now, Scott, do you think there's a chance that the US might actually target the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei?
Well, I think Israel's targeting them. That's the question. I mean,
Do you
because
think that the US will get involved in that plan? Because Trump obviously said he said, look, we know where he is. He can't hide basically, but we don't plan on assassinating him.
yeah. So the when the Israelis approached the Americans soon after they launched the operations, because the Israelis claim they've wiped out 21 of 22 senior military commanders. They asked the Americans if they would support the targeted assassination of the Supreme Leader. And U.S. officials let it be known to the media that they said no. But we're now further into this. Trump, of course, on social media has said, we could get him. We're not going to, but we could get him. 2 days ago, the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said that Ayatollah Khamenei should cease to exist. So I think it's a question not of whether the Israelis, not if the Israelis are trying to get him. It'll be whether they're able to get him. And if the Israelis get the Supreme Leader, it puts the Americans in the decision of, do you criticize the operation or do you accept it? And I can tell you what the answer is going to be. They're going to accept it. Remember,
Of course,
America.
it's US machinery, it's US intelligence, it's US
Sure.
weaponry. But Scott, we have to kind of move along and get into what's happened to Iran's foreign minister. He's on his way to Moscow to have this discussion with the Kremlin. We
Yeah.
need to discuss kind of what does Iran plan on getting out of this?
Okay, let's cut to the chase here. You asked me about Iranian attacks. I think if Iran was to carry out direct attacks on the U.S., they're going to just invite and open the door to an escalation of U.S. and American attacks on themselves. There's no gain out of that. The one possible exception to that is the Houthis in Yemen. I'm not convinced the Houthis, although they're an Iranian ally, are fully controlled by Tehran. They have autonomy. They could escalate attacks on Red Sea shipping. So keep an eye out for that. But beyond that, I think Iran's play here is political. Iran's play here is we're the victim here. We're the ones that suffered, not just Israel now, but the U.S. breaking international law. They had no reason to hit these facilities because we're not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Are you going to let them do this? And so what the Iranians did immediately today is they said, we're going to go to the Supreme Council, the National, try one more. We're going to go to the Security Council in the UN. It's been a long day. We're going to go to the Security Council in the UN, and we're going to go to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we're going to ask them to condemn the U.S. and Israeli attacks. Now, that's not going to happen in terms of a formal act because the U.S. is going to veto any resolution in the Security Council, right? But the Iranians will make the political points there. But what has been equally important is where has the Iranian foreign minister gone in the past 24 hours and where is he going next? He went straight from the Europeans to go to Turkey because, of course, he's going to talk to the Turks. And the Turkish president, President Erdogan, is a very loud proponent of getting a negotiated settlement, right? So he's in Turkey, the attacks take place, and of course the Turks come out very strongly and condemn them. And the Iranian foreign minister has a high-profile press conference to set out Tehran's line. The U.S. is supporting a genocidal regime, the Israelis, in carrying this out. He now goes to Moscow to see what the Russians will do politically. The Russians aren't going to get involved militarily, but politically in terms of support. So you got Turkey, you've got Russia. What do the Chinese do? Now, the Chinese have come out with a statement. You have to watch their press carefully, but their English language press. They came out with a statement a few hours ago condemning these attacks and its violation of international law and the UN Charter. So the Chinese are going to pose as the defenders of international law and of the UN to take advantage of the situation. Iran's play here is to line up everybody to say that it has been effectively, it's the victim. And if they do that, they get some political space in these negotiations that are going to come. But that raises the question that I introduced a few minutes ago. How hard do the Gulf states push this? Because they are rivals of Iran on the one hand, while not liking this because it destabilizes the region. And will Europe speak with a unified voice on this? And if so, will they put pressure on Washington?
And we saw in the last week that a few Chinese planes had actually been seen in Iranian airspace, potentially picking up some Iranians in Tehran to help them out while these attacks were going on, and fly them out of the region, potentially doing some sort of cargo shipping. We weren't quite sure. So we're not sure how involved the CCP are, Scott, but if we've got the CCP and the Kremlin working in Iran's favor, it really does change the nature of this conflict.
I'm not sure it changes the nature of it, a fundamental. It raises some possibilities here. One thing about those Chinese planes, look, there's a simple explanation for this. I'm not saying this is what happened, but before you make the jump there,
Yeah.
Chinese planes would have gone in to evacuate Chinese nationals, and they would have gone
True.
in. They would have gone in to evacuate sensitive documents that the Chinese have in Tehran, right? Because if it all goes pear-shaped, they don't want them there. So I suspect that's the starting point for the Chinese. In terms of the play here, the fundamental here is that Israel ain't going to let anyone stop them from continuing their attacks on Iran, right? They're going to keep pushing this until they can break the Iranian leadership, all right? So that's the starting point. And even if the United States does not carry out further attacks, the United States is giving a blank check, possibly all the way up to the attack on the Supreme Leader that we discussed. So that's the starting point, right? So who's going to come in and halt those attacks? Now, no one's going to come in with military force in support of the Iranians to halt the attacks. Not even the Russians are going to do that. The Chinese certainly are going to do that. That's not the Chinese play here. Who's going to be someone who would actually side with Tehran in pushing back on Israel? I think at most what you get is this political sympathies with Iran to call for de-escalation and to give the Iranian regime breathing space so it survives.
Yeah.
Because I will handle one other myth that's here, Maddie, which is important. Because I was on a UK outlet today, which shall not be named, but let's say that it's very, very right wing and is the outlet of a particular political party. And I heard about 10 things that were blatant falsehoods before I went on air with them, with the previous guest. Won't name the guest, but you can look it up later, anybody that wants to do a deep dive. And one of the ones was coming out of an Israeli journalist, out of who said, and this who has become this British outlet's correspondent in Tel Aviv. So, all the Iranians, they want to rise up against the Ayatollahs. They want to get rid of them and so on. And so all these attacks, we don't want regime change in Israel, but Iranians will rise up against us. I'm just going to tell you, as someone who has worked in Iran before 2009, when it was too hot to go back, because I'd be waving at you from prison, as someone who has a lot of Iranian friends there and has a lot of friends outside the country as well, Iranians inside the country do not want to change the regime through Israel. That's not the way they want to do it. They want rights and reform. If it's done through Israel, what it's going to do is it's going to stigmatize a lot of Iranians who are calling for reform. It's going to set off probably internal clashes. I don't know how far they'll escalate. I don't think they'll be as bad as Iraq, but they'll be bad. And it's going to leave a power vacuum. That's what happens. And the Iranians look back at Iraq in 2003 and say, look, we want our freedom. We want our gradual revolution. We want to reform or even change the regime, but we want to do it with support for us, not by Israel and the U.S. setting the terms.